Morning, I'm Adele with the group work team of Dundee Carers Centre, and this video has been created because unpaid carers told us they wanted to know more about this issue. It's an issue that we as parents really don't want to think about, which is what happens to our children after we've died. Having worked with several parents as a group work team member, we found that parents who have children with additional support needs, what can be classed as a disability, this is a topic that they worry about, not just think about, but worry about. And they've asked us, how can they prepare? They want to know how they could best support their children when they're no longer here. With that in mind, today Lorna Christine from local Solicitors Thornton has kindly agreed to talk about this subject with us, and I'm going to hand this over to her now. Morning, Lorna. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Adele. So today we're just going to have hopefully quite a general discussion about some of the issues that have been concerning people, where you have a child that maybe needs a bit of additional support, and your main concern obviously is what if you're no longer here to give that support. So I'm going to talk about trusts, not in too much of a technical way, but I am going to speak about trusts and wills and that kind of thing, and what you can do just to make yourself feel a wee bit better or a bit more prepared for the future, so that you don't have that worry, if something were to happen to you. So just to start with a couple of basics, and just to explain what a trust is. So I always like to think of a trust as a box, which sounds a bit of an odd comparison, but it's really a place where you put funds that's separate from the person that's going to benefit from the funds. So you place those funds into a box, and the fund is managed by people called trustees, who you choose to manage the fund, and they manage it for a beneficiary. And that beneficiary could be your child, for example. So where we have a child maybe that isn't able to handle money very well, or just couldn't cope with it and wouldn't know how to deal with money, that might be a situation in which you wouldn't want them to receive the money outright when you die. So when you put a will in place, you might leave your assets to your children or family members, but if you have a concern about how that child might cope with money, then putting a trust inside the will is a way of controlling that situation. So in that situation, you would create the will now, and you would set up the trust, but it wouldn't be active now. It would be dormant. So it would be sitting ready until the point at which it's needed, which is when you're no longer here. So what you would want to think about in terms of the will, which has the trust inside it, is who the trustees are going to be. So they would be the people who would manage the money for your child when you're no longer here. So that could be their siblings, maybe if they're growing up. It could be aunts and uncles. I think ideally what you would want to have is a mix of ages, so that there's always going to be someone to look after the assets. You also want to appoint people who know the background, who know your child well, and also who know what your wishes might be in respect of the funds. Ideally, you would want to have maybe at least 2 trustees of differing ages. Now, those trustees in the future could bring an additional trustee on once the trust is up and running if they wanted to, but you need to have those maybe 2 initial people in place. And obviously, it's a good idea to speak to them before you mention them in your will. So that's the trustees. Now, the trustees obviously would hopefully know you and know the background and know your family. But what you might want to do, in addition to the will that you're creating with the trust inside it, you might want to leave something called a letter of wishes. Now, that is a document that sits alongside the will or the trust, and it just explains what sort of things you might want the funds to be used for. So if you think of the trust within the will as a framework, and maybe the letter of wishes as additional guidance, that's quite a good way to think of it. So the additional guidance is for your trustees. So for example, if you wanted the money to be used for, say your child needed medical care, but there was a long waiting list in the NHS, if you were happy for money to be used to go private, that's something you could put in the letter of wishes. If you were happy for the funds to be used for holidays or even education or a particular kind of equipment, all of these different things, you could list that in the letter of wishes. Now, the letter is not legally binding, but it's a really good guide for your trustees. And there might be the odd occasion in the future where they just don't really know what to do, and they could look to that for a bit of guidance. So if you are in that kind of situation, probably what you would want to think about is visiting a solicitor to put a will in place and having a trust in that will for your child who maybe has additional needs. So you could, for example, have 3 children, and you might want to leave 2 parts of your estate to outright to your other children, and the third part would be held in trust. So you can do that. You can split it so that, for example, I have 2 daughters. I could leave one half of my estate outright to one daughter, and the other half could be held in trust. So it doesn't have to be the whole estate that's put into a trust. You can separate it out. Now, some people say to me, well, why don't I just leave it to my other child and they'll just keep the money for my child and sort of give it to them? You could do that. There's a bit of a risk with that, I suppose, in that what if something happened to your other child? You know, what if something happened to them? So the good thing about the trust is it's set out. There are trustees' powers in the deed to allow them to act. There are lots of different things that the trustees can do. One thing I get asked about a lot as well is accommodation. So you might have a child that lives with you and you think they will live with you for a long, long time. So quite often the house might be your main asset, and you're not sure what to do about that. So I think as well, particularly at that time, if something was to happen to you, the last thing you want is your child to be forced to leave the home they've known, as well as grieving for you. So that's a big concern. So a house can be placed in trust. That is possible. So you can put a house into trust. Obviously, if it's your main asset, you might feel that you're giving less to other children that you have, but that is something that you could discuss with them, or you could discuss with a solicitor. But it's just to mention that it is possible for a house to be held in a trust for the benefit of a beneficiary. Okay. And the type of trust that we use in the will that I'm speaking about is called a discretionary trust. Now, a discretionary trust is really flexible, and the main thing about a discretionary trust is that we usually state a number of beneficiaries in the trust. So, for example, if you're leaving half of the residue of your estate in trust, but it's for one of your children, you would have to still name a number of beneficiaries in the trust. And the reason for that is a discretionary trust, there needs to be discretion as to who receives the funds, so no one has a real right to them. So we know that ultimately the money is going to be used for one of your children, and the letter of wishes backs that up. But in order for your child to still receive benefits that they might be entitled to, we need to use the discretionary type of trust, so that there's that flexibility there, because that's something that I get asked about quite often too, about benefits. So if the funds are held in discretionary trust, your child doesn't have an absolute right to them, because the discretionary trust has a number of beneficiaries, and that protects the benefits position. So that's certainly something we get asked about quite a lot. So the trust I'm speaking about is contained within a will, and that's normally when people would be looking to create this kind of trust, because it's when they pass away that they have money to pass on to children. You can set up trusts during lifetime as well. So for example, if you had money and you wanted to put money into a trust for your child now, you could do that during your lifetime. It would be a similar document, but it's just that it would become active straight away. But certainly, usually, it would be a trust within a will that we would be speaking about. So once the trust is up and running, the trustees would manage the money. They have certain duties and responsibilities. For example, if there was quite a large sum in there, they would have to take investment advice about how to get the best return on that money. But they would be guided by a solicitor, when the time came. Obviously, if it was just a house in the trust, they wouldn't have the same requirement, because there wouldn't be additional funds to invest and so on. So they would be guided in that, but they do have certain duties and responsibilities as trustees, and that's why it's quite important to ask them if they want to act in this capacity, and also to ensure that you're choosing the right people to fulfil this role when you're no longer here. So I've got a note of some questions I think that were often asked by people, and I think I've maybe covered some of them already, but I thought I would just go through some of them just to make sure. One of them was whether a trust could be changed after it's written. So in the will, the framework for the trust is set up. So the trustees' powers are in the will, the beneficiaries are in the will, and so on. But as I mentioned before, you can change trustees later. So for example, if you've appointed your sister and your niece as the trustees for your child, if your sister later on finds it all too much or becomes unwell, the trustees can appoint someone else. They would need a solicitor to do that. They would need a document prepared called a deed of assumption and resignation, but it's fairly straightforward. So they would be able to do that. The trustees' powers are set out and are quite extensive. They're quite flexible. So, for example, the trustees can invest in whatever they need to invest in. They can open bank accounts. They can invest in property, all of these different things, because we want the trust to be flexible. We don't want them to be limited in what they can do. But yes, you can alter things later on. Another question was what happens to the trust fund if the main beneficiary passes away. So, for example, this is very far in the future. If you've created a trust for your child, and the main aim is that while they're here, you want them to be provided for, you want them to be cared for. But for whatever reason, obviously at some point they may pass away. So what you can do there, so the trust fund could pass in term, you could have a direction in the will about that, about what's to happen. So it could be that it passes to your surviving children if you have any at that point, or their children, so that would be grandchildren. So you can provide for that eventuality. But the idea usually with these kind of trusts is that most of the money is going to be used during your child's lifetime to support them. You're not meant to be just keeping the money for some future date. It's really a trust that's going to run just now so that they can have equipment, just to make their life easier, whether it's a holiday. And if it was a holiday, they might need additional support, someone to go with them, for example, all of these different things, or even if it's to buy a PlayStation 5, something like that. All of these different things, the money is to be used for the person while they're here. But yes, you can direct what's to happen to it once they're gone as well.
Okay.
There's another question here about, can there be a number of funds for the same beneficiary? So you might have relatives, for example, that might want to leave money to your child. Now, I don't think you want 5 different trusts for the same person sitting, that's maybe not the best idea. If your trust was already in existence, other people could add to it. So, for example, if you had created a fund, it might be possible for maybe, I don't know, your brother, if they maybe wanted to leave money to that child after you've gone, to add funds to it. So I think whoever was wanting to leave money to your child would need to take advice from their solicitor about what to do. But yes, in theory, it is possible to add, to that fund. They could create their own fund, but I don't really think you would want to have, too many different funds of small amounts for the same person. It would be easier to have it all in the one place as long as they were happy with that.
Yeah.
I've also got a note here of, can a trustee be a beneficiary? Yes, a trustee can be a beneficiary. So, for example, I mentioned it's a discretionary trust that we create, and we have to have a number of beneficiaries. So just coming back to me again, I've got 2 daughters. So if I was creating a discretionary trust in my will, I would have both of them as beneficiaries and maybe my 2 nieces, for example. But I know it's for one of my daughters, but I might want my other daughter to be a trustee, and that's absolutely fine. There's no problem with that. I think a lot of people worry that a beneficiary or a potential beneficiary can't be a trustee, but they can. But obviously, when they're acting as trustee, they have to act with their trustee's hat on. They can't act in their own interest. They have to act in the interest of the beneficiary. So, for example, they couldn't just make over the funds to themselves or something like that, because that obviously wouldn't be in the interests of why the trust was created. Okay. Was there any other questions that you had, Adele, that I've not covered?
The only thing I could think of, which comes up quite a bit, obviously, parents are concerned that if they have to go into a nursing home and the house is the main asset, could it be sold to pay for nursing home fees? How does that affect?
Yeah, so nursing home costs are a huge topic, and we've spoken before about them to people. It's something we're often asked about. So if the local authority can't take your house away from you to fund care, they have a duty to provide care to you, and they will issue invoices for that care, but it's really up to you how you pay for that care. So you, as an individual, would have to make a decision about how you pay for the care. If you're a couple, so for example, let's just say mum and dad in this scenario, and dad goes into care, they won't include the value of the house in their calculations because mum still lives there. So that's an exception. So you wouldn't have to worry if one person goes into care. But in that example, if dad's in care and mum then dies, you might worry, well, what would happen now? Because obviously mum's no longer there. Now, there are other exceptions. So if you have a child over 60 living with you, for example, the local authority don't take the house into account. I think if you were concerned about that, the best thing to do would be to take advice, because every family situation is different. And while I'm speaking about general exceptions, it's always good to sit down with someone just to have a bit of advice about your situation, which will be different from other people's, and your concerns, which will be slightly different from everyone else's, just to make sure you are getting the correct advice, because it's not really a one-size-fits-all answer. But it's a definitely a topic we're asked a lot about, but you can get guidance on it.
Okay. And is this something, when parents are creating their will, is this something that could be dealt with at the same time, with the knowledge that it could be changed in the future if necessary?
So there are certain types of wills that we can prepare that can maybe try and pass assets in a different direction, so that they're maybe not staying with the mum and dad, if you like, so much, so that if one of them goes into care, you're not going to have to, they won't have as much in their name, when they go into care, that could be used for care costs. So there certainly are different types of wills. So I think if you were going in to make a will with a solicitor, whatever your situation is, you would be looking at things like who the beneficiaries are, what their needs are, what are your concerns? Are your concerns care costs as well? Are your concerns inheritance tax? What are your worries? And your solicitor should really be sitting down with you to come up with a will, a solution for you that addresses all of those concerns. So when you make a will, you would usually meet with a solicitor to have that initial discussion. A draft would be prepared, and then you would go back to sign the will. So really what you want to do is sit down with your solicitor and get that advice firsthand. But yes, if you've got a worry about care costs or something else, you should definitely mention that and look at that at the same time, because you don't want to draft your will, just worrying about one thing and then come back later and have to change it again. We want you to be happy with what you have in place.
Yep, that's lovely. Thanks, Lorna. I'm just having a quick look at the questions, and I was asked, could a trust fund be challenged by another family member?
So in Scotland, there are certain people who have rights to your estate. There's something called legal rights. I don't know if you've heard of that. So for example, your spouse, civil partner, or children have certain claims on your estate. And the idea behind that legislation is really that you can't write your children out of your will. That's the kind of background to it. So if you have, for example, 2 children and you decide to leave your whole estate to one child, the child that has not been mentioned in your will can claim legal rights in your estate. Now, legal rights only apply to movable assets, so not to houses. So movable assets are things like cash, investment, cars, contents. They would cover that with you. Usually you would want to make sure that you are leaving something, to your children. For example, you can leave a legacy to a child of the amount equivalent to legal rights, just so it's covered, and then there's no bad feeling, if you like. But certainly it's something that you should be discussing, with your solicitor.
Right, lovely. I'm just thinking about, is there a website that you would suggest? I mean, the video is really helpful and I think it covers the main topics, but sometimes people want to just browse a bit. Is there a website you would suggest?
We do have certainly at my firm at Thornton's, we've got booklets on this that we could send out to people if they were interested. But there's not a website as such that would have general information on trusts. There's some information on trusts for vulnerable beneficiaries on HMRC's website, which you could potentially look at. That might be one place to look.
Lovely. Thanks, Lorna. That's all the questions. I know that you've been really helpful and come to do sessions for carers in the past, so we were able to gather up a lot of the questions. Yeah, I think this has been really helpful. It sounds like a lot of thought's been gone into covering every different potential situation. But I think the take-home message is, if in any doubt, take legal advice. Would that be right?
Definitely. At least make that first step of going to see a solicitor, and then it's all about control. You would feel a bit more in control of the situation.
Yeah. Oh, lovely. Thanks very much for your time, Lorna. Thank you.
No
Bye.
problem at all.